March 9th, 1966. 8:35 in the evening. The Blind Beggar Pub, 337 Whitechapel Road, East London. George Cornell was sitting at the bar nursing a light ale when Ronnie Kray walked through the door with a 9mm Mauser pistol in his coat pocket. Cornell looked up. He smirked. He said 5 words that some witnesses claim were,
"Well, look who's here."
"Well, look who's here." Ronnie did not answer. He walked across the floor, raised the Mauser, and put a single bullet through George Cornell's forehead from 3 feet away. The jukebox needle skipped on a record called "The Sun Ain't Gonna Shine Anymore." Cornell slid off the stool and hit the floor dead. Ronnie walked out. Nobody in that pub saw a thing. Not the barmaid, not the regulars. For 3 years, not one witness would speak. That was the power of the Kray twins in 1966 London. This was not a Hollywood gangster moment. This was not the slick suit and tie elegance of the Tom Hardy film. This was a public execution in a working-class pub, witnessed by a dozen people who would rather lie to Scotland Yard than admit what they saw. Because in the East End in 1966, you could see a murder happen 6 feet in front of you and still tell the police you were in the toilet. That was the law, the Kray law, and it kept Ronnie and Reggie Kray untouchable for almost a decade. This is the story of how Hollywood took the most violent criminal partnership in modern British history and wrapped it in cashmere suits, jazz piano, and Tom Hardy charisma. The Legend movie from 2015 gave you the myth, the style, the glamour, the brothers in matching suits walking into nightclubs while celebrities lined up to shake their hands. What it did not give you was the truth. The systematic violence, the protection rackets that bled small business owners dry, the witnesses who disappeared, the bodies that were never found, the psychological warfare that turned the East End into an open-air prison ruled by 2 men with the same face. But here is what the film could never show you. The real Krays were not legends. They were monsters with good tailors. And the only reason anyone remembers them as anything else is because they killed enough people to make everyone else too scared to tell the truth. Ronnie and Reggie Kray were born on October 24th, 1933, in a small terraced house at 68 Steen Street, Haggerston, East London. Reggie came first. Ronnie followed 10 minutes later, smaller, weaker, sicker. Their mother Violet adored them both, but she favored Ronnie because she thought he might not survive. He nearly did not. At age 3, Ronnie caught diphtheria so badly the doctors told Violet to say goodbye. He survived. Some people who knew the family later said Ronnie was never quite right after that. Something in his head broke and never healed. Their father, Charlie, was a wardrobe dealer, a small-time hustler who spent the Second World War on the run from the military police. He drank. He disappeared for weeks at a time. Violet raised the boys mostly alone, and she raised them to believe they were special, different, touched by something the other Bethnal Green kids did not have. By the time the twins were 10, they were already fighting in the street. By the time they were 16, they were charged with assault for beating a boy half to death outside a dance hall. The charges were dropped because the witnesses suddenly developed amnesia. It was a pattern that would define the next 20 years. In 1952, the twins were drafted into the British Army for national service. They lasted 1 day. They punched a corporal in the face on their first morning and walked out. They spent most of their service in military prison, getting into fights, refusing orders, and learning that they preferred jail to working for anyone. By the time they were dishonorably discharged in 1954, they had a plan. They were going to take over the East End, and they were going to do it through the one business that gave young working-class men access to money, power, and respect: boxing. Both twins had been amateur boxers. Reggie was the real talent. Quick hands, cold eyes, the kind of fighter who never looked nervous in the ring. Ronnie was a brawler. He hit hard, but he had no defense. He did not care about defense. He wanted to hurt people. In 1954, they bought a snooker hall on Eric Street in Mile End for £100. They called it the Regal. It became their headquarters. From that single dingy room above a row of shops, they built an empire. Here is how the protection racket actually worked, because the film never explains it. The Krays would walk into a small business, a pub, a cafe, a betting shop. They would sit down. They would order a drink. Then Ronnie or one of his enforcers would say something like, "You have got a lovely place here. Be a shame if something happened to it." The owner had two choices. Pay £50 a week, which was about half the average British wage in 1955, or refuse and watch your windows get smashed, your stock get burned, your customers get beaten in the car park until nobody came to your business anymore. Within 18 months, the Krays were collecting from over 30 businesses across Bethnal Green and Whitechapel. By 1960, that number was over 100. The money was small individually. The total was enormous. They were pulling in around £2,000 a week in pure protection cash, the equivalent of about £50,000 a week in today's money, and they had not committed a single major crime that the police could prove. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is how they made themselves untouchable. They did not just terrorize the East End, they charmed it. They paid for funerals when an old woman in the neighborhood died. They gave money to widows. They sent flowers to hospitals. They were photographed at children's birthday parties. The same hands that broke a man's legs on a Tuesday were buying drinks for his mother at the pub on Friday. The East End loved them because they were local boys who made good. The East End feared them because they killed people. And in the working-class culture of 1950s London, that combination of love and fear made them gods. By 1960, they had moved up. They bought a club called the Double R on Bow Road, named for Ronnie and Reggie. Then they got into a West End club called Esmeralda's Barn in Knightsbridge, paying around £1,000 for a majority share. Suddenly, the East End boys were rubbing shoulders with aristocrats. Lord Boothby, a Conservative peer in the House of Lords, became a regular. So did the actress Barbara Windsor. So did Judy Garland when she was in town. The Krays loved photographs. They loved being photographed with celebrities. David Bailey shot them in their famous portrait in 1965, the one that hangs in every East End pub today. Two men in matching dark suits, hair slicked back, eyes dead. That was the image they wanted, the image Hollywood would later sell back to the public for £10 a cinema ticket. Now here is what legend got right. It got the brotherhood right, the dependency, the way Reggie could never escape Ronnie no matter how much he wanted to. It got the time period right, the music, the cars, the cigarettes, the cufflinks. Tom Hardy's physical performance as both brothers was extraordinary. The film shows you that Ronnie was unstable, that he was openly homosexual at a time when that was illegal in Britain, that he was paranoid, violent, and probably suffering from undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. All of that is documented fact. Ronnie was sectioned in 1958 and diagnosed with schizophrenia. He was on Stemetil for the rest of his life. When he stopped taking it, he became dangerous. When he took it, he was a slow-moving man who heard voices and believed people were plotting against him. Sometimes they were, but here is what legend got wrong. Or rather, what it left out. The film softens almost everything. It shows you the violence as stylized, almost balletic. The real violence was nothing like that. When Ronnie ordered the beating of a man named Lenny Hamilton in 1964 because Hamilton had insulted him at a club, Ronnie used a red-hot poker. He branded the man's face with it. Hamilton lost the sight in one eye. He never spoke about it for 30 years because he knew what would happen if he did. The film shows none of this. The film shows Ronnie as eccentric, charming, dangerous in an interesting way. The real Ronnie was a man who once stabbed a fellow gang member in the stomach with a bayonet at a Christmas party because the man had laughed at the wrong joke. The film also softens Reggie. It shows him as the reluctant gangster, the brother who wanted out, the man who loved Frances Shay and tried to build a normal life with her. Some of this is true. Reggie did love Frances. He married her on April 19th, 1965. The wedding was photographed by David Bailey. It was the social event of the East End year. But what the film barely shows, and what Frances's family has spoken about for decades, is the reality of that marriage. Frances was 22 years old. She was fragile. She suffered from depression. Reggie's controlling behavior, his temper, his absences, his refusal to let her have any independent life, drove her to a breakdown. She moved back to her parents. She tried to escape him. On June 7th, 1967, Frances Shea was found dead in her bedroom from an overdose of barbiturates. She was 23 years old. The official verdict was suicide. Some members of her family have always believed it was something darker. What is documented is that Reggie was devastated, and that within 4 months he would commit the most savage murder of his entire career. Before we get there, we have to go back to the blind beggar, because to understand why Ronnie killed George Cornell, you have to understand what was happening in the underworld in early 1966. The Krays were not the only firm in London. There was another major outfit called the Richardson Gang, run by Charlie and Eddie Richardson out of South London. The Richardsons were brutal. They were famous for what was called the torture trials, where they would tie men to chairs in scrap metal yards and use pliers, generators, and bolt cutters to extract money, information, or just amusement. George Cornell was a Richardson man. He was big, loud, and stupid, and he had made a fatal mistake. At a club called the Astor in December 1965, Cornell had called Ronnie Kray a fat poof in front of multiple witnesses. In the East End in 1966, you did not call Ronnie Kray that. You did not call him anything. You crossed the street when you saw him. But Cornell had said it, and Ronnie had heard about it. And Ronnie was a man who heard voices telling him that everyone was plotting against him. So when Ronnie got word on the evening of March 9th, 1966, that Cornell was drinking alone at the Blind Beggar, just half a mile from his own home, he made his decision. He told his driver to bring the car around. He told his henchman, Ian Berry, to come with him. He picked up the Mauser. He walked into the pub. He shot Cornell in the head. He walked out. He went home. He changed his clothes. He had a cup of tea. Here's where it gets interesting. 3 years passed. 3 years where Ronnie Kray walked freely around London after committing a murder in front of a dozen witnesses. The barmaid at the Blind Beggar, a woman named Mrs. X in court records to protect her identity, knew exactly who had walked in and pulled the trigger. She would not say it, not to the police, not to her husband, not to anyone. The 2 men drinking with Cornell at the bar saw everything. They said nothing. The regulars in the pub said they were looking the other way. Scotland Yard knew Ronnie Kray had done it. They could not prove it. And every time they tried to build a case, witnesses would withdraw their statements, or move house, or have unfortunate accidents. The Kray network was so deep, so saturated through East End life, that the police could not break it. This is what legend never quite captures. The film makes it look like Scotland Yard was just always one step behind. The reality was darker. Detective Superintendent Leonard Nipper, Reed of Scotland Yard, had been trying to nail the Krays since 1964. He failed in 1965 when a witness who had agreed to testify suddenly refused. He failed again in 1966. He failed in 1967. Every case he built collapsed because witnesses were too frightened to give evidence in court. Nipper Reed later said it was the most frustrating period of his career. He knew the Krays were guilty of multiple murders. He could not get one person to stand in a witness box and say it out loud. Then came October 29th, 1967, the murder that finally cracked the empire. Jack the Hat McVitie was a small-time enforcer who had worked for the Krays for years. He was 35 years old. He drank too much. He always wore a hat to cover his bald spot, which gave him his nickname. In the summer of 1967, Ronnie had paid McVitie £500 to murder a former Kray business associate named Leslie Payne. McVitie took the money. He never did the job. Worse, He started telling people in pubs that the Krays were finished, that he was not afraid of them, that Ronnie was a mental case who could not even take his pills properly. Word got back. Ronnie wanted McVitie dead. Reggie agreed. The decision was made. On the night of October 29th, 1967, McVitie was lured to a basement flat at 97 Evering Road in Stoke Newington. He was told there was a party. When he walked in, the music was playing. There were people there. Reggie Kray was standing in the middle of the room with a gun. Reggie pointed the gun at McVitie's head and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. McVitie panicked. He tried to run. Ronnie grabbed him. Reggie picked up a kitchen knife and stabbed Jack the Hat McVitie repeatedly in the face, neck, and stomach, in front of at least 8 witnesses. The murder took several minutes. McVitie did not die quickly. He bled out on the basement floor while a house full of Kray associates watched, frozen, knowing they were now bound to silence forever. That was the mistake. That was the moment the empire ended, because unlike the Cornell murder, where Ronnie had killed quickly and left, the McVitie murder happened in front of too many people. The body was wrapped in a bedspread and driven away by Charlie Kray, the older brother, who later claimed he did not know what was in the bundle. McVitie's body has never been found. Some say it was dumped in the English Channel. Some say it was disposed of in a furnace in Bermondsey. What is documented is that within 12 months, the silence that had protected the Krays for 15 years began to break. Nipper Reed got his break in early 1968. He brought in a witness named Leslie Payne, the same Payne that McVitie had been paid to kill. Payne had survived. He hated the Krays. He talked. Then more talked. Then the dam broke. Reed made the arrests on May 8, 1968. Ronnie, Reggie, Charlie Kray, and 15 members of their firm were taken into custody in dawn raids across East London. The trial began at the Old Bailey on January 7, 1969. It was the longest murder trial in English criminal history at the time, running for 39 days. On March 4, 1969, the verdict came in, guilty on all counts. Ronnie Kray was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum of 30 years for the murder of George Cornell. Reggie Kray was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 30 years for the murder of Jack the Hat McVitie. Charlie Kray got 10 years for helping dispose of McVitie's body. The judge, Mr. Justice Melford Stevenson, said in sentencing, "In my view, society has earned a rest from your activities." Ronnie Kray was certified insane in 1979 and transferred to Broadmoor Hospital, the high-security psychiatric facility where Britain's most dangerous mentally ill prisoners are kept. He spent the rest of his life there. He held court for decades, receiving visitors, giving interviews, marrying twice from inside the asylum, and slowly losing whatever grip he had ever had on reality. He died of a heart attack on March 17, 1995. He was 61 years old. Reggie Kray served 29 years in various British prisons. He converted to Christianity. He wrote books. He married a woman named Roberta Jones in prison. He was finally released on compassionate grounds in August 2000, when doctors confirmed he had inoperable bladder cancer. He died on October 1, 2000, just 5 weeks after his release. He was 66 years old. The legend film ends on a note of tragedy and brotherhood. The real ending was bleaker. Both twins died as broken men. The empire they built collapsed within hours of their arrest. The clubs were closed. The businesses they had extorted got their lives back. The witnesses who had been silent for years finally testified and lived. The East End that had feared them moved on. By the 1970s, a new generation of London criminals had taken over, more sophisticated, less visible, less interested in being photographed by David Bailey. What the legend movie sold you was the myth, the style, the suits, the idea that organized crime could be glamorous if you had the right tailor and the right haircut. What the documented record shows you is something else entirely. The Krays were not visionaries. They were not businessmen. They were two violent, damaged brothers who ran a small protection racket in a poor part of London for about 15 years Before their mental illness, their arrogance and their inability to stop killing finally caught up with them. They generated less money in their entire criminal career than a single mid-level cocaine importer makes today. They controlled an area smaller than most American cities. They killed 2 men that we know about and probably several others we will never confirm. And then they died, slowly, in cells. The truth about the Krays is that there was no glamour. There was only fear. The suits were costumes. The nightclubs were stage sets. The celebrity friendships were transactions. The real Ronnie Kray heard voices and stabbed people with bayonets. The real Reggie Kray drove his wife to suicide and then butchered a man with a kitchen knife. The real story is not legend. It is what happens when 2 boys from a broken home, raised in poverty, marked by trauma and untreated mental illness, decide that the only way to be somebody is to make everybody else afraid of them. They succeeded. And it destroyed them. And it destroyed everyone who loved them. That is the price of the Kray legend. And no movie will ever show you that price honestly, because there is no soundtrack that can carry that weight. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment below. What other Hollywood mob movies got the truth completely wrong? Tell us what you want us to break down next.